Because shite matters. Welcome to Alone in the World. With me, Hursh Joshi. Okay, we're here today with Oscar Guardiola-Rivera. Is that how you say it?
That's good. Your Spanish is
Terrible.
getting better and better.
Oscar's an academic here at Berkeley in the University of London. He's working on, he's a lawyer apparently, and a philosopher.
Some time ago I did practice, yes.
And I hear, and he's written a couple of very sort of well-received books. One was called If Latin America Ruled the World, and the other one I can't remember the name, but I think it might be.
I think it might be around here. So there you
Story
go.
of
Story
a
of Death Foretold,
which is about Pinochet and the plot against Salvador Allende.
Yes, yeah.
So in those, the reason I'm talking to you today is because very much, even though those books are kind of historical retellings in some sense, they also seem to be very much about the possibility to make a different world. Having spent some time in this world, just a few years, I become more and more disillusioned as I see events going around me, whether that be Brexit, whether that be the election of Donald Trump, whether that be the new president in Brazil, and so on. And I just wanted to, just maybe to hear a little bit about how you, what you think about. Let's just start with what you think about what's going on in the world today.
We live in dark times, perhaps the darker times we've seen since the 1930s. But as Frantz Fanon used to say, it is precisely in the darkest times, when you're surrounded by darkness, that you begin to build the light. Not to see the light, but you begin to produce the light. In other words, it is when you're surrounded by the worst circumstances that you become aware once more of your own agency. And if you can own it and use it, that's when dark turns into hope. He had a wonderful line in one of his plays. You also know that I would rather introduce myself as a writer, and I've wrote a few plays and produced a couple of them. And the one play by Fanon that I prefer is called Parallel Hands, and he has this wonderful line, "Blessed is darkness." It is in darkness where you find blessing. That is to say, when you find within yourself the force that has always been there, but it has been sucked out of you. And that's what all these strong men and these corrupt, in the political sense, powerful people do. They're not powerful because they are special in themselves. They are powerful because they have managed to make a lot of people think that they are just victims, that some external evil is threatening them, and then they give up their own sense of agency. And once they do that, they they deliver that force into the hands of these awful people, who then become very strong. That's the moment that we are in at present. We are in a state of darkness, but we must be aware of the fact that state of darkness is there because we have allowed it to happen. People like Trump, people like Jair Bolsonaro, those kinds of people do not fall from the sky. They are risen to those positions by our own willingness to give up our own agency, our own sense of motion, our own sense of imagination. But it is when we're there, at the darkest time, that we can recover that sense.
Okay, you say it's when we give up our sense of agency, allow ourselves to be victims. And in a sense, I completely agree with you. But from another perspective, it seems to me that technology And the way that we are now capable of being surveilled constantly, the way that all of our behaviors are able to be subsumed into the bigger system and made sort of like, oh, you're just part of this niche, or you just belong to this lifestyle, or, you know, or you come up with sort of really hateful words, but because you can join a group on the internet, then suddenly it's normalized, those hateful words. And there's a sense in which technology is also disarming us, which makes it more difficult for me to see the way out. And I'm just wondering if you had any thoughts on that.
Well, chances are this particular film will be viewed by people on one of several devices, either their phones, their smartphones, or their tablets or their computers. And in each and all of those cases, there will be an interaction between the platform that is in and or behind those devices and the person who thinks she or he is merely a spectator. But that interaction is from the very outset, and this is the potential and the curse of our newer technologies, and I'm using the term in inverted commas, I'll tell you why in a second. These are not totally passive relations. What we don't know is the problem. There is some sort of technological unconscious there. And I use the term unconscious in the very precise sense of that term, meaning that there are things we don't know about what is going on when we're interacting with our devices, but these things which are in the darkness can be brought to light. So for instance, we think we're just viewing this film, but the platform that is inside the device or behind it is at the same time capturing your information. And those algorithms are trying to organize your behaviors and your tastes and your choices into some kind of pattern. Now, here is the trick, and it is an optical trick, which is why I've been speaking from the very outset in terms of the visual field, as well as of dramaturgy, darkness versus light, and so on, appearing and disappearing, and so on and so forth. The fact of the matter is that because we now believe that every single one of our behaviors, our encounters, every single event can be expressed in a number, for instance, a price, we then misleadingly fall for the illusion that those events which can be expressed quantitatively become part of temporal sets, which are then amenable to probabilistic understanding. And that's the trick, because the algorithm is there trying to organize everything you do into a pattern so that then it can preempt and or predict your future behavior. I think the most radical and problematic change that these later technologies have brought with them is the fact that the future now seems foreclosed. We now have we have fallen for the illusion that we can predict the future, but it is an illusion. What we also know is that no one knows the end of the story. And that obscurity is a blessing. The fact that time is real and therefore open in terms of both physics and metaphysics mean that newer and better things can still happen. But for us to understand that these technologies are just giving us the illusion of foreclosure of the future, not the reality of it, we must also understand that they work cinematically. That is to say that these interactions we have with these screens and these algorithms and so on and so forth do have the same structure of cinema, which is to say they have image, they have motion, they have interaction, and they frame us in certain ways. But every filmmaker, such as yourself, knows very well that you can always frame things differently, that when it comes to motion does not need to follow a specific line, but there are moments when the camera is capturing, as this one is doing, capturing our very movements. Well, not even us can predict what direction our interaction will take. And that's something that film and the cinematographic apparatus has revealed to us from the very outset. I find it most hopeful to go back in time and reread the first writings of those who began using the camera. Not only people like Siga Vertov, but for instance Jean Epstein, who was the secretary of the Lumiere brothers. And he has these fascinating things to say about what the cinematographic apparatus does. For the first time in humankind's history, it allows us to tap into the fourth dimension, something that we humans cannot do. But because of these non-human apparatus, we can now see time going in reverse. We can accelerate it. We can freeze it. And what that tells us is that although time does follow a line, so that the glass that broke cannot be unbroken, it is also the case that those timelines are superpositioned with others. And there you have a very different notion of possibility, one that has political consequences. Very many possibilities are superpositioned in any event. And that's when we realize that we can gather in a different stage, and a stage frame things differently, move in a different orientation, and therefore our interactions do not have to be framed solely by the profit motive, by the making of money, by exploitation.
Okay, I mean, what you're giving me is maybe the inklings of the beginning of the possibility of hope, personally. But the step that I find difficult in what you've just spoken about is when we talk about the foreclosure of the future.
Mm-hmm.
And that it has given us the illusion of the foreclosure of the future. It brings me to think that what's more dangerous than us actually having the illusion of the foreclosure of the future is that power and those in power have the illusion of the foreclosure of the future. That they have the sense that they can control, that they can understand, that they can predict, and using that sense, and when more often than not, until we actually find some way to break out of this foreclosure, their predictions are verified.
They will realize themselves.
And so they believe that foreclosure, and that gives them the ability that, and we were talking about this earlier, how there is nothing radical anymore, because everything we do, whether it's me being a vegan, whether it's you wearing your lovely skull and crossbone braces, or it's if you decide to become a porn star tomorrow, nothing is radical, nothing is prohibited. And in a sense, I feel that comes from the sense that power has now, that it can predict, that it can foreclose, that it can control. And that's maybe the more dangerous illusion for me, the illusion that power has. And that, in a sense, by feeling that it doesn't need to control in the way that it used to, it makes it easier for it to control.
I hear you very well, brother, and this is precisely the point. Of course, if I decide to become a porn star tomorrow, or attempt to become one, other things will open up for me, things that I cannot foresee, not from where I stand. Perhaps that will not change the big picture, the scheme of things, perhaps. But it already gives us what you call the inklings, the beginning, a glimpse, a little glimpse of the fact that the future remains open, even though we have fallen for the illusion that we can foreclose it. Not just us, but those who rules us, as you pointed out very well. Here, though, to use a less individualistic example, we should recall the fact that many before us found themselves in that particular position. And here, I think it's very important to learn from the experience of peoples of color all over the world, because they have been in this position of vulnerability, this position of darkness, for a very, very long time. I'm always reminded of this experience that Fanon and Césaire and others in the Negritude movement relate in various ways. Fanon speaks of a time when he went to the cinema and he's beginning to watch this picture and he already knows what is going to happen. The black guy will be erased. And what he sees projected there is precisely the way others see him, as non-existent, as invisible. So, of course, he reflects on the fact that he might see himself through the eyes of those who see him as non-existent. And this is happening more and more, not just to black folk, but to many peoples around the world. Because of these technologies makes us more aware to the gaze of others and the way they see or unsee us. And that makes us feel strong, that gives us a stronger sense of non-existence, of non-value. I value nothing. Look at all those celebrities, they are of value. Look at those billionaires, they are the ones who control things. Look at those politicians, that's value. Myself, well, if I decide to become a porn star tomorrow, that wouldn't change anything. I have no value. And that reveals us as dependent upon the gaze of others. But then that very same realization also means that you're looking at yourself. And then you ask yourself, why am I looking at myself solely through the eyes of others? So you have this superpositioned situation. You know you're dependent on what others say about you and the way they see you. And we're becoming more and more aware of that in our Facebook interactions and so on and so forth. And that can have these really detrimental consequences that you talk about. This sort of passive resistance. I'm just a cog in this machine. All I can do is like or dislike. And others will react to me in accordance to those likes and dislikes. This is nothing new, in fact. This sort of imitation effect at a very large scale has always been part of the basic blocks of society building and of politics. Every single skilled politician has known that you only have to show a certain image of evil that threatens a certain people, so that they react against being seen in that way. And that will make you powerful as soon as you announce yourself as their savior. I mean, you don't have to read Niccolo Machiavelli to know that. You can go back in time and see that. But you also, as you go back, you can see that we have also been very imaginative at innovating and creating devices to stop those who would like to see us and would like to see us through their eyes as invisible, to stop them from doing that and to see ourselves, to appear in different ways. And this is the most political radical act, and it's most radical now because so many people are being pushed into that situation of invisibility and vulnerability to reappear. And that appearance will inevitably and immediately be seen as violent. So if you look at, Ocasio-Cortez appearing, or all those women appearing all of a sudden in the midst of Trumplandia, you see how powerful that appearance is. And these guys like Trump immediately react. They try to fire up the people against them, and of course there will be a conflict. We must also understand that that is unavoidable. It's not just complexity. It's asymmetry, and asymmetry means clash. There will be a clash. You asked me before how I see the world these days. Well, I look at what just happened in Brazil, but also in my native Colombia, and I see these two, I'm not going to call them alt-right leaders or, new rightist leaders. These are, in Latin America, what you have is very old-fashioned fascists. And Bolsonaro and Duque or Uribe are precisely this kind of guys, throwback to the 1970s, to those dictatorships. And I see Venezuela in the middle, with all of its problems, its internal divisions, its attempt at, paving the way towards a revolutionary future, the stalling of that attempt, and so on and so forth. And I know that there is going to be a clash. And then I hear John Bolton, expounding his theory of a troika of tyranny in reference to Cuba, Nicaragua, and Venezuela. And you can see what they are cooking up. Perhaps if there is an impeachment, perhaps if there is an electoral weakening of the position of the strong man, in this case in the United States, they might try and fire up these peoples to fight against each other. And reap off the dividends. Hence the caravan of peoples from the south supposedly threatening white privilege within the United States. But of course, what lies behind those fears, the staging and the illusion, and these are created things. We should treat them dramaturgically. These guys are setting a stage. What lies behind that is the fact that, as I demonstrated in What If Latin America Ruled the World, even if you were to close the borders of the U.S. Today, completely and utterly, as Trump would wish to do, still, by 2040, whites will no longer be a majority in that country. It's the inevitability of that future. So you see, I've spoken before of the openness of the future. In the sense that there is a future in the past. We cannot see from our position what will happen later on. But I could also speak of the future in the past. If you project that 2040 scenario of demographic change, you can see that things are bound to change. And a lot of people in the United States, particularly, white working class people in the Sun Belt areas who have been abandoned earlier on by both leftists and rightists, they're reacting against that. But reaction, that kind of reacting means they are acquiring a certain consciousness. It's not
absolutely.
It's
let
not
me
all
ask
terrible.
you something about that, because that sense of consciousness, I bring this back to the UK now, and we hear a lot about how the demographic, which is supporting Corbyn's so-called radical Labour, and that which is supporting the Conservatives has flipped around. How the working class are now UKIP or Conservative supporters, and how increasingly it's the educated middle classes in urban areas that are supporting Labour and the left. And just a question about how that affects your analysis of how the future in the past, as you called it, will come to be.
Peoples around the world are acquiring a new consciousness. You can call it a class consciousness if you wish to use the old Marxist chestnut. But as soon as you use your Marx, you must also bring your Nietzsche into the concoction. And when you put these two into a dialogue, you remember what they both saw in the Paris Commune. Marx saw hope because these peoples were reaffirming themselves. But he was also very critical of the ways in which those who were resisting within the Paris Commune also gave up their agency at some point. Whereas, in apparent contrast, Nietzsche was very critical of their socialism, meaning Dühring's socialism, which is really the precursor of National Socialism, which is to say, when you put these two together, what you see is that consciousness, of course, can go in two very different directions. When you're acquiring a sense of groundlessness, of not belonging, of the world changing very rapidly and leaving you behind, you can react against it. And you can easily be persuaded to think, oh, there is somebody else who's doing this to me, the migrant, the evildoer. And then you give up your responsibility. That's when the strongman wins. And that's when you go in the direction that Brazil has gone with Bolsonaro, or a sector. Remember, it's not the whole of it. Yes, he got some 55%, but there is a 48% who clearly does not want to go in that direction. Similarly for the US, here in Britain is the same. We are deeply divided. And that division should not be seen solely as a negative, because that means that there are peoples acquiring a certain consciousness. But as I said before, it can be just a passive consciousness or an active form of it. It can be reactive or active. And because of that, it is of the utmost importance to go out there, go out of here, out of academia, go back to the streets, go back to the platforms, and remind people that they are not just being moved by some kind of external force, but they can also move themselves. Once you engage in that exercise, you begin to see that reaction is not the only and perhaps not the best way. There is also the way of action, outward and forward-oriented action, which is to say, changing the scheme of things, changing the frame. Let's change together. Let's gather together to change the rules of the game, to change the way we are being framed by these apparatuses of vision. And that, to me, is what the movement that produced Corbyn, not Corbyn himself, that's what it is all about. I went to Liverpool earlier this year. During the Labour conference. And of course, what was most interesting to me was not the inner workings of the political apparatus and its apparatchiks. Those people are always framing themselves within the box. They always inevitably wear gray, dark blue suits, and they appear in a certain way. That fashion, to speak of fashion, yes, since you refer to it, is a conscious choice. I'm going to make myself fit so that people see me and they think, ooh, here is the next leader. Look at how serious he or she looks. For women, it's much more problematic than it is for men, because they're being obliged to dress up as men. And we saw that during the Clinton-Trump campaign. She had to wear, inverted commas, men-like suits and so on and so forth. But as soon as you left the area of the convention and you went around and you attended meetings put together by Momentum and others, you begin to see the various colors, the various fashions. So it is then when you begin to see radicality. What is the meaning of radicalism? To quote a great Brazilian anthropologist, well, the square root of 2 is to go to the root of everything. And the square root of 2, as we all remember from school, is an infinite number. We cannot foresee its end. And that ability of allowing, to quote somebody else, an infinite number of flowers bloom, that's when you see radicality. And that can also be expressed in the way people present themselves. So my braces can be in that respect radical as much in as much as I am trying to invent a way of appearing that would be seen somewhat problematic, for instance, in a Latin American context. Why is this lawyer dressing up in such a way? Why is he recovering the legacy of his Afro-Caribbean father rather than trying to appear more white, which I could in certain contexts, if only because that might give me a certain advantage. Those are, each and every single one of those, so not just fashion decisions. Yes, they are fashion, they're about fashion, but they are, as you yourself put it, deeply political. And they don't have to be the same for everyone. For some, punk has no radicality anymore. But in some other contexts, it might. Here I'm always reminded of something that two art collectives, European art collectives. One comes from the former Yugoslavia, the Neue Slowenische Kunst. These guys put together a certain aesthetic that would make them appear very, very close to their fascist forebears. But that proximity served them the purpose of immediately twisting the illusion. So you have to be, this is the dangerous part, you have to go very, very close to the illusion. You have to grasp it. You have to understand it so that then technically you can twist it, turn it on its head. That's what we need to do with these technologies of vision. We need to understand them much better. We don't. The cinematic technicality of it is still obscure to us. It is the same kind of technicality that allows the financial system to hold. To establish its iron hold over the economy. It's this idea of prediction and preemption, ditto for the political system. So maybe we are in a similar situation to that in which in late medieval Christian folk found themselves. We're in front of these clergy that speaks a lingo, a language that we cannot understand. It was Latin back then. They were speaking with their backs turned to us. Now is the language of the media and or the language of financial economics. Who understands what a CDO is or a derivative and all those things which appear on an everyday basis at the bottom of our TV screens? Or we don't know what that is. That's like Latin for us. And it acquires that sort of superhuman meaning precisely because it seems to be the word of God. But just as during the Reformation and the Counter-Reformation, a lot of people just grabbed the Bible and read the story of Moses and thought, oh, that's exactly what is happening to myself and my other peasant friends who were displaced from during the Scottish clearances. This is exactly what happened to myself and my African friends when we were kidnapped from Egypt land and brought to the plantations of the Americas. At that point, you grab that technology and twist it on its head. This doesn't mean that the technology is inert. It is not. Some of the designs of these technologies are there in order to constrain our future choices. But we can always cut them up and repurpose them. We can, and this is yet another cinematic technique, montage. And I find it very, very useful right now to go back and look at the aesthetic of the earlier 20th century as well as that of the 1970s. And what you see is, to begin with, the beginning of resistance, of hope, is these kinds of new aesthetics. Cut it up, repurpose it, recombine it, splice them, sample it. And that's what you see in many of our arts right now, the visual arts, but also in music. And yes, they can be co-opted, but they can also find a way to get themselves out of the cage. Look at the meaning of grime music vis-a-vis the movement behind Corbyn. Of course, Corbyn didn't produce that. I'm certain he doesn't even understand what grime is. Perhaps he doesn't even like it. And yet, this is precisely the point. That music, in its splicing, sampling, in its in its use of really dirty sounds and so on and so forth, is expressing a sense of poverty, a sense of invisibility, but is using the poverty and the invisibility to build something different, to build spaces where people gather. That's what we need. That's the very the best meaning of aesthetics of music. It's not just the product or the album that you can buy. It's the space that you produce, the time that you produce, as if history stops and then people come in, and when they participate with you as the performer, if the participation is felicitous, what you have there is the force of a performance. And that performative force creates, it has the power to create different institutions. That's what we need to harness.
I'm finding this interesting because, I mean, we had, back in the day, the Commons. There was the Enclosures Act. We moved on to this notion of the Undercommons, of places like university being, where people could gather to create knowledge and share knowledge. And in a sense, we were talking earlier before we went on camera about the privatization of higher education in the UK. And now I'm beginning to now my sense of hope is increasing somewhat, because I'm hearing somewhere here that actually where there's a recreation of the undercommons as places to share, places to be radical, place which is coming through music that is actually arising in exactly the spaces where it's needed, rather than in the libraries of privileged middle class university students. Do you have a comment on that? Am I reading you right?
You are, and of course this isn't something that I came up with. This is the very history of all art forms. Of course they can be captured, and they might be, perhaps they will be at some point. But then at the very point of capture, something escapes. There is always this excess. That excess which I've spoken of in terms of the futural. This, I'm coming out as a temporal realist, if you like. It is because no one knows the end of the story beforehand that there is political agency. This is not just potential, but what non-Western medieval philosophers, particularly Muslim thinkers, would term with words that were then translated into the Latin potentialitas. And that means not that you are some sort of reservoir of power that others can exploit. We may be that. But we're also objects in motion. We're elements in motion. And as we move, no one can determine where we will fall. Let me put it otherwise. We're all falling. We're all falling, literally speaking. We know that, if we were to look at our planet from the viewpoint of the universe, well, you couldn't point a north, a south, an advancement, or a backwardness. Those concepts are illusory to a certain extent. You can rather say we're all falling, gravity and so on and so forth. But because we're falling, at the same time, we don't notice it. Motion is relative. Movement is relative. Notice, we're not talking metaphysics. Yes. We're talking physics here.
Yes, absolutely.
And as we fall, what we need to understand is that there is no ground. People speak colloquially of touching rock bottom. What if there is no bottom? And actually, we know there is no bottom. So that means two things. on the one hand, the sobriety of knowing that things can always get much worse. We should not hold on to this illusory idea that we are inevitably progressing. We may have progress. I'm sure we have made progress, tremendous progress in many ways. There is less poverty nowadays. There is less. There is still a slavery of the old kind, but much less than there used to be. Perhaps it is on its way to disappear. There are also newer ways of industrial slavery appearing, and so on and so forth. So that's on the one hand. On the other hand, because we're all falling, because we're all damnés, to use Fanon's terms once more, we can understand also that it is a matter of affirming ourselves as we fall, of falling together. So if there is no ground, if there is no rock bottom, nobody can fool me by offering me the promise of a new ground. Here is the Bible as your new ground. Here is the nation. Let's make America great again. This is your new ground. Great again. Ground again. Or a leftist promise of the land of milk and honey. And then, if having understood that there is no ground, still you think, well, if nobody can promise me, if nobody can promise the apocalypse or the land or paradise, then anyhow, I'm going to move. Even if there is no guarantee as to the outcome. Why am I going to move? Because I'm already moving with everything else. But now I'm going to do so with everything else, humans and non-humans, those who are close to me and those whom I cannot even see, those who are beyond my horizon. At that point, you're pushing the boundaries of the possible. And that's the task of any radical. I would say, of course, that's the task of the left, to push the boundaries of the possible.
To imagine the unimaginable.
Correct.
And in terms of, and just finally, so we have this notion of movement, and in that movement, it's not just a movement, but it's a movement where we see that we're constantly in motion.
Yes, it's motion,
and there's an
interaction, interface,
and there's an inevitability to that motion. So to try and prevent that motion, in a sense, makes no sense.
Is foolish. Yes.
The only sense that can that there is actually to, in some way, reconnect with our own agency, what you were talking about earlier, so that the motion that we are going to be engaged in anyway, somehow, at least partially, has a direction that comes from us. And that the way for that direction that comes from us to actually make some sense is for that motion in some way to be affirmed by the others that are falling, as you said, with us. And so it somehow has to be collective. And that is all grounded, and I'm trying to figure out how it's grounded, but somehow it's grounded in imagination, in art, in the possibility of seeing anew.
Now you're hearing me, brother, and that makes me very happy. You got it, of course. This has to do, very completely speaking, with motion, movement, and migration, which is, of course, what is frightening so many around the world. You're absolutely right. There is an inevitability to it, meaning that if you look back to the past, you see that you yourself and your ancestors, whether they came from Africa and or Europe, have been in motion. Of course, we don't have to go. Those of us who come from Latin America only have to backtrack 30 or 40 years ago to remember how the Doors And there are doors, there are borders, there will continue to be doors and borders of some kind. We're open to our European brothers and sisters, and we welcome them. Our fathers and mothers were welcome there. Just as before, some of our other forefathers and foremothers were brought into the Americas by force. In both cases, actually. Because those who left Europe during the Second 30 Years' War, during the First and Second World War II, they didn't do so because they wanted to. No German left Germany because they just wanted to. No Spaniard left Spain during the Franco dictatorship just because they wanted to. You asked me before about my own journey. I am a migrant. And that's my journey, that's my story. I did not leave Colombia because I wanted to. I was forced to do so. Nobody moves because the heck of it. They move because of very real conditions that push them. But as they do, what they want to escape from is precisely being moved from without. They want to regain a sense of agency. And if they nowadays move towards Europe and or the United States, it is not because they have some illusion about either Europe or the United States being the lands of milk and honey, but because solely in the action of moving, they are recovering their sense of agency. And actually, if they move towards the United States, perhaps that is akin to the way in which Africans, Asians, and Afro-Caribbeans during World War II, when Europe was under siege and occupied by fascism, they moved here in order to help their European brothers and sisters freeing themselves. Because in freeing their brothers and sisters, these people who came from Asia, Africa, and the Afro-Caribbean to join the French resistance or the British Imperial Army, in the case of India and the former colonies, they were, in the very act of freeing their brothers and sisters, freeing themselves. That building of newer alliances, that's the potentialitas of our brothers and sisters now moving from Africa or from the so-called Middle East or from south of the Rio Grande towards our places. Newer alliances. This is not to say that we should simply do away with borders, open borders. You know, that's how the far right would like to characterize our everyday lived experience in terms that makes us look like lunatics. Of course, we're not saying that. You know, we're not done with the nation state. We're not there yet, and that's, you know, Brexit has a purpose and is to remind us we're not done with the nation state. In fact, in the case of Britain, and this is a difference, perhaps an answer to something you asked before, the difference between the British situation and the situation of the United States is that, unlike the US, Britain has never been an independent nation. It has never been that kind of thing. It used to be, it has had different guises throughout its history, but the most recent one, well, it was the center of an empire. And that's not being an independent nation state. So now it is trying to figure out how it can be that. Some say it has to do so on its own. That kind of isolationism is fictitious, not just fictitious. It's silly insofar as we're never in a situation of falling on our own. We're falling with others. So another way of seeing Brexit would be what kinds of new alliances we can put together. And I'm not talking about, these fantasy trade agreements with the US or whatever. I mean, if you sign a trade agreement with the US, well, we Latin Americans can tell you exactly what will go down. We will be fucked. As the Mexicans are, as we have all been for such a long time. We don't want that for our British brothers and sisters. We know how bad that will go. Even if some of our British brothers and sisters think that somehow, because they're white and used to be the colonizer, they're going to be well treated by their equivalents in the US. No, they're not. They will not. Rather than that, is what kinds of new alliances we can put together with our immediate neighbors and those who are coming. because it is the whole of Europe that needs to reinvent itself to save itself from itself. It's not about saving ourselves from the hordes of that are coming in. We need to save ourselves from ourselves. There is a wonderful monologue, if memory serves me well, written by Harold Pinter, delivered by Christine Scott Thomas, in which she plays the role of a Brexit voter, a Leave voter. And she concludes the monologue by saying, well, in the end, we understood that we didn't want to merely go out of the EU or whatever. We wanted to go out of ourselves because we're unsatisfied with who we are in the situation we're in at present. I say, let's do so. Let's get out of ourselves. Let's get out of the present situation. But let's do so together with others in a way that can reinvent the world precisely in terms of these inevitable movements. Our brothers and sisters from Syria, from Africa, are moving. They will continue to move. We cannot just stand by and allow them to drown in the Mediterranean, which is what we are doing at present. At least some. Others, such as yourself, are doing the right thing. You were telling me before about inviting this Nigerian brother who went through that journey to live into your home. Well, there you go. You began this conversation by saying that you felt a little despair. Maybe. But at the same time, by opening your door, your house to this Nigerian brother, you give me hope, not the opposite. So we end this conversation with me being hopeful.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Oscar. I've got 1,000 more questions that I want to ask you. But what we'll do, I think, is maybe do another session another time. But today I am also leaving the room with a little bit more hope. I'm feeling a little bit more energized about the fact that I'm not completely alone in the world.
Well, it is me who has to thank you, because it is your example that questions me into doing something else than just spouting these words and writing some other things and just talking to my students. We need to go out of here. We need to go back to the factories. We need to go back to the streets. We need to open our doors to our brothers and sisters who are coming in so that we forge the new alliances that will inevitably change the world.